Hi, and welcome to my podcast. I'm Glenn Cooper. I'm a business broker in Denver. I've been helping people buy, sell, and value small businesses for nearly 50 years. I've also written the only book on the subject, which we'll get to in a moment. In these podcasts, I'm going to tell you all of my secrets just as I do in my book. Today, in this episode, I'm going to tell you why being different adds value to your business and what I mean by being different. The title of this whole podcast series is What's My Business Really Worth? And the real surprise today is that I'm actually going to try to convince you that my formula for an elevator pitch of all things is what you should master as part of what being different would mean. An elevator pitch, as you may know, is that annoying chatter that people often say when they introduce themselves at a networking event. I want to teach you how to not to be annoying. That will make you different. And for the sake of clarity from now on, I'm going to use sales pitch and elevator pitch interchangeably. But right now, you're probably thinking, an elevator pitch? What's he even talking about? How is that at all relevant to what a business is worth? Well, let me explain. In my first podcast, I mostly just introduced myself. In my second and third podcasts, I actually covered most of what's substantive in the first 3 chapters of my book. What your business is really worth is affected dramatically by how you approach what I outlined as the 5 challenges in Chapter 1, how I addressed the dozen professional services that business brokers provide, that's in my Chapter 2, and how you set up your systems to work with prospective buyers, both the 4 basic questions you ask them as well as the 7 steps I suggested for processing them, all of which is in my Chapter 3 and Podcast 3. I'm sorry that it takes so long to get through all these necessary preliminaries, but it does. Selling a business is a big undertaking, even when you hire an experienced business broker. It's even harder when you don't. So in this podcast, Podcast 4, I'm going to talk about how you need to be different. Podcast 5 will be on specific sales techniques. And then finally, Podcast 6 will be about business appraisal. These first 6 podcasts cover the first 6 chapters of my book. And as in my book, these first 6 podcasts are the foundational introduction to all of the rest that I will talk about in this entire podcast series. How long can I talk about this subject? Well, actually forever. Small business values are changing year to year as the small business world itself continues to change, as buyers and sellers change, and as even we practicing business brokers change. Actually, if you think about it, even for just a moment, you'll realize that the word value is a very loaded word. And by loaded, I mean powerful. In business appraisal, we measure value in monetary terms, but value of a business to an owner can go far beyond money. So hold on. We'll even show you how your business value is tied to that elevator pitch that you need to learn as you sell your business. All of this is covered in my book, Glenn Cooper on Business Brokerage. Today is just from Chapter 4 in my book, but all of my podcasts will be based on the book, so getting my book is now the best way to follow along. The average chapter in my book is 3,500 words, and in a podcast, I can't even speak fast enough to cover even one chapter, so you get so much more in the book. My book is also for sale on Amazon, and yes, you should buy it if you are either selling your business yourself or if you are working with a broker who is, or if you yourself are or want to be a business broker. And as in the previous podcast, I've explained that you can either buy the big printed book, which will look great on your bookshelf, or you can buy the Kindle version, which is convertible to a PDF. My book was originally designed for teaching business brokers. And so Chapter 4 in my book is about differentiating a business brokerage firm from others. My Chapter 4 argues that we business brokers need to master our elevator pitch for our business brokerage firm. When we talk with sellers, we, who are business brokers, must create 2 sales pitches. First, we have to sell ourselves to our seller client prospects so they'll list their business with us. Then, if we get hired, we create at least 1 elevator pitch for every business we have listed. For any business brokers now listening to me, most of you know that we must create multiple pitches. One to get listings, yes, then one for each business we list, yes, but that's not all. Frankly, we brokers also have to vary each sales pitch because every buyer is different. So we become elevator pitch masters. So that's why today's podcast is about creating an elevator pitch for your business, because that's what you need to do. I'll pause for a moment here while those of you who are watching the video can see the elevator pitch cartoon that we just put up. For many, an elevator pitch is a source of humor because I think in most cases it's done poorly. But right now I want to talk about why it is important, when it is used, and answer your question, how do I get started? Where do I start? So let me give you some background and try to answer these 3 questions. The elevator pitch gets its name from its need to be no longer than the length of an elevator ride. That's an important thing, because people's attention spans can be as short as 20 or 30 seconds, or if you get stuck in the elevator, maybe 60 seconds, sort of like a television commercial. Why is this important? Well, with selling, you need to explain that your business is different from others. And by different, I mean better. You need to tell buyers how it is better. You'll need to practice describing the good features of your business in response to even the toughest of buyer questions. It's important to memorize the list of features you want to emphasize in every conversation and to learn to speak about those features efficiently, because the same questions will be asked over and over again by many prospects that you'll need to talk to before you actually know you have found someone. Often it can be that the first prospects through the door are actually the best. When we run an ad on Biz by Sell ourselves, sometimes the first few calls are in fact the best buyers. Remember that they're the ones who we put through the 7-step screening process and that I listed in podcast 3. And at the very least, we know that they have represented in writing that they have the cash needed and they've signed a non-disclosure. So practicing your elevator pitch ahead of time is a good thing to do before talking to such a buyer. You will get better with practice, but it would be nice if you are already well practiced when you're in front of that early just right buyer. But when else is the elevator pitch used? Well, it can also be used to get rid of someone. It might make it easier, for example, to get rid of that buyer who isn't going to buy your business. With practice, as you talk to potential buyers, you could also get a sense for the buyer prospects that seem like they're wasting your time. Trust your instincts. You will know. When you are well practiced in what your business offers that's different, you'll be able to use those differences as examples of why it's not right for certain people, perhaps like the time waster you're then talking to. Okay, so where do you start? Let's start with an example. Let's assume that you have an ad for your business on Biz by Sell, the website I discussed in my podcasts. A buyer prospect calls you in response to your ad, and you have already put this buyer through your screening process and NDA signing. You've already sent him your presentation packet on your business, and now you have some sort of phone call or Zoom call or meeting set up with him. Your first meeting is about to start. You're going to ask him the 4 questions I gave you in podcast 3, but his first question to you is one of those toughest questions that a buyer can ask a seller. He says, "Can you give me a quick summary of how you came up with the asking price?" Surprisingly, that is one of many questions you may get that can also lead you into that elevator pitch. In fact, just like a politician, you can answer any question, but always use it to segue into your elevator pitch. So here's one way you might answer it if that question is asked to you and thrown to you unexpectedly. You might say, "Yes, we gave it a lot of consideration. I started this business 20 years ago with my partner. We had done this work for someone else, then went on our own, both at age 50. We were so excited to work for ourselves. As it turned out, we were really good at it. We set up systems and worked as a team to refine those systems today so that just one person can run it now. This is still a fun business to run, but we now are ready to retire. We now have 3 full-time employees who do 90% of the work. We also have a complete operations manual that we all follow. We have a solid repeat business of about 3,000 customers who've used us more than once, and many have been with us for years. Those repeat customers account for 80% of our annual revenue. We actually keep a database with a file on each customer. But we have not yet tackle the task of further automating that list in a way to keep regular contact and possibly cross-sell a broader range of services we could offer. So there's a new opportunity there for future growth, but we're ready to retire. We're more expensive than any of our competitors, but our service system creates the repeat customers that our employees can then treat like family, so it overcomes those price differences. Our system also allows us to pay the employees more and makes their job much easier. Each of our employees are trained in the job estimating software on their laptop, so they are empowered to tell customers what a repair or replacement will cost and why just before they do the work. It also enables them to offer a discount for immediate payment. Most customers know we charge more, but they hire us anyway because we're on the scene to answer those questions before the work begins, as well as when they get the bill right at the end of the job. This business is perfect for a hands-on owner who wants to learn the systems first before trying to expand them. It's best suited to someone with a background in home construction and maybe home repair. It's best for a buyer who wants to be part of our community. We don't want to sell it to a national franchise. It should be grown to be a local leader in this area. That's why we want to sell to a buyer who will live here and share in the same pride that we have. That is a very special, that we have developed a very special company. You saw in the presentation we sent you that you can make a very comfortable living by buying this business at the asking price. If what we outlined to you is close to what you want, it's probably a fit. So how does what we outlined in our presentation differ from what you want? I just gave you a 489-word possible elevator pitch for your business. Can you see why it would take some thought and practice to come up with something similar for your business? So now let me describe just how to craft this elevator pitch. The perfect elevator pitch follows a structure. It's no more than a list of ingredients for what I call a success recipe that I will offer in future podcasts. No matter what context, you always want to follow a structure. I express it in just 4 words: purpose, promise, offer, and difference. When briefly describing your business, in this case, you merely make sure that your listener knows the purpose of your business, what promise it fulfills, what primary offer it makes to customers and clients, and what positive difference that matters that it can make in the lives of every person it touches. So even if you're asked a tough question about pricing, you can still use that structure. The specifics in those 4 categories, purpose, promise, offer, and difference, will differ widely depending upon the context. So you do have to know your business well enough to improvise as needed. In the answer to the buyer's questions about price, I used this outline myself to make up this response. But notice how the seller's answer was aimed directly at giving it a context for this buyer's needs. So I pivoted to the purpose of why it's up for sale, the promise it fulfilled for the 2 people who started it, the special relationships it offers both customers and employees, and the difference that makes for this buyer. This business appears to give a buyer a lot of what most buyers want. It's building a strong market position. For the buyer these sellers are looking for, it will be the right location. It still has a growth potential in the use of its database. The quality of its earnings is 80% repeat business. It can now be run by one person. It has an operations manual. And to answer the question on price, this seller gives the buyer a question. How does this fit in your perception? The purpose of the business began as an answer to self-employment of the partners. The seller in my example said that they were excited to work for themselves. That's an example of a purpose that a buyer would likely find appealing. This seller then went on at length describing what this business would promise to this buyer. The sellers have already empowered their employees to give incredible customer service, creating 80% repeat business sales volume. Even though they are the most expensive in the market, it can now be run by one person. What they're offering is a turnkey business that runs smoothly. The presentation the seller sent this buyer is a complete description of price and terms. These sellers have even defined the type of buyer they want. Finally, the difference here is actually somewhat unsaid. It's in the description of the kind of buyer they want. They want someone who eventually shares in their pride of having built a great business. Their final question, how does what we outline differ from what you want, invites the buyer into the beginning stages of a friendly discussion. In my book's chapter 4, there's a completely different elevator pitch. Comparing the two and seeing how they both follow the purpose, promise, offer, difference outline would help you grasp this concept. There is an elevator pitch for every situation in which you need a concise but complete response. If you've hired an experienced broker, your broker probably knows this. But if you're on your own, you need at least to have thought this through. You need to take time to consider the outline I'm suggesting. When you answer questions from a buyer, you are selling with every word spoken to that buyer. Hopefully, too, if you were in a real situation, you would also then proceed to make sure you had the answers to the 4 buyer questions I told you to ask in podcast 3. Having those answers would help you understand what this buyer needs to hear. Creating an elevator pitch outline for potential buyers and all the other things I'm talking about in this podcast series is from my book. We have now covered the first 4 chapters of my book, and as I have said, it's available on Amazon. Its title is Glenn Cooper on Business Brokerage. With or without this podcast, it is the book you need to read. It was designed as a training guide for business brokers, but it also works for anyone selling their business. There are lots of books on starting and running a small business. Sometimes they have a chapter or 2 on selling a business. This book is the only one of its kind. It's a big book, 125,000 words in 36 chapters. It also prominently contains my personal cell phone and email addresses, so you can call or email me anytime you have questions. My next podcast, podcast 5, is on the most important thing you need to know about selling and negotiating. Then you'll be ready for podcast 6 on business appraisal itself. All these podcasts are relevant to understanding what your business is really worth. That question is the title of the series. But you did need to know first how hard it was. That was podcast 1. You also needed to know what brokers do wrong. That was podcast 2. You needed to know how to handle buyers. That was podcast 3. You needed to know how to talk positively about how your business is different. That's this podcast 4. And then the next podcast 5 will talk about the way most common sales and negotiating techniques are all wrong. Stay tuned. I will see you next time. And thanks for listening.